And now I'm pleased to introduce Stephen Prothero. Stephen Prothero is a professor of religious studies across the river at Boston University, where he teaches the popular course Death and Immortality, among numerous other courses on religion in America. He also writes prolifically about religion, including articles for the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, Slate, and Salon.com, among other publications. He's written several books on American religious history and education, including most recently the New York Times bestselling Religious Literacy: What Every American Needs to Know and Doesn't. His new book, God Is Not One, combats the widespread assumption that all of the world's religions provide different paths to the same God. In our modern globalized society, it is essential to find points of commonality with those of vastly different cultural backgrounds. But Professor Prothero argues that it is equally important to acknowledge and understand the differences in our backgrounds and beliefs, and that doing so can enrich our global relationships.
How did I come to write this book? I started off my teaching career after I graduated here. I went down to Georgia State University in Atlanta, and I was teaching religious studies there for about 5 years. And I was under the mistaken impression that when I talked to my students about religion, that they knew what I was talking about. And I would any kind of teaching you have to start where your students are, and I would just say things like, Matthew, and I would assume that they thought I meant Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, and they were thinking Matthew Perry of Friends, and I didn't really get that until I moved to BU. And when I was at Georgia State, I had the impression my students understood what I was saying, and I moved to BU, and it became clear to me really quickly that they didn't. And the way that I figured that out was that I would say things like Matthew, or I would refer to the Bhagavad Gita or something like that, and they would give me this look, which I now refer to as the look. And the look is the look that we've all given, which is when you know you're supposed to know something, but you don't know it, but you don't want the person who said it to know that you don't know it. Right? And I think the look, I'm not an actor, but the look goes something like this. It's like, and my students, I just noticed, were giving me that look. So what I decided to do was I decided to test them and see what they knew about the religions of the world. And I developed this religious literacy quiz that I included in my last book on religious literacy. And I asked them what I thought were the simplest sorts of questions, like name the 4 Gospels, or what are the 7 sacraments of Catholicism, or name a Hindu scripture, what are the 4 noble truths of Buddhism. I tried to think of simple questions. Not how old was the Buddha when he died, or what was the last sentence of the Buddha. I tried to think of simple questions. And my students did horrible. 9 out of 10 of them flunked the quiz. And the part that really amazed me that they did so badly on was a section on the Bible, where I had biblical characters on the left side of the quiz sheet and then biblical stories on the right. So the goal, for example, was to match the left side, Adam and Eve, with the right side, the Garden of Eden. Who were those two in the Garden of Eden? I think it was Adam and Eve. And others were, Abraham and Noah and Paul. And then there was, on the right side would be, the binding of Isaac and, the flood and the road to Damascus. And I would want them to draw, from one side to the other. And one of the choices also was Jesus. I think maybe that was crucifixion. I'm not remembering what it was. But anyway, a lot of the quizzes came back where the line was drawn from Jesus just to all the ones on the right side. Like, I've heard of this guy. Like, he must have been involved in these stories in some way or another. Or, like, that's a good guess. Like, they had been trained in the SATs, if you sort of go with your first intuition or something. So that made me realize that my students really knew very little about the religions of the world. And if I was going to be teaching them about the world's religions, I had to sort of start from zero. And I just thought this was strange, given how religious America is, right? This is one of the most religious countries in the world. And so then I started wondering about my own children, and my father was a medical doctor. He was very keen on separating the work life from the home life. And I realized I was doing that too. I wasn't really talking about religion with my kids. I wasn't going to talk shop with my kids. And so I was wondering, what do they actually know about religion, So I was at a Bible Sunday in the Lutheran church. And Bible Sunday in the Lutheran church is a day when the kids who are baptized I think they're in second grade, and they're given a Bible. And in the Lutheran tradition, when kids are baptized, the parents and the godparents promise to, among other promises, to put the scriptures in the hands of their children. And this is the day, Bible Sunday, when you literally put the scriptures in the hands of your children. And so I was given this Bible, I guess you could call it a children's Bible. Had a picture of Jesus on the cover, very happy, white, American-looking Jesus. He actually looked a lot like me, except he had more of a cleft, chin or whatever. And he had a lamb on his shoulders, and adoring children, looking up at him. So I handed the book to my daughter. She was very proud. And we left the church and we went into the car to drive home. And I thought, all right, it's Bible Sunday. I need to talk about the Bible with my daughter. This is a teachable moment. Let's see, what does she know about the Bible? And so I said, let's talk about the Bible. And she said, great. And I said, why don't you tell me some Bible characters? And she said, great. And then I said, other than Jesus. And then I was driving, but I looked in the mirror, and she gave me the look, She was like, and then she started to cough, which she does when she doesn't know the answer to a question, because she doesn't want to admit it. And then she was silent for a while, and then I was totally determined I was not going to give the answer. I was not going to fill the silence with anything. I was going to wait. And so I waited, and she coughed some more. And then she said, Tom. I was like, Tom? And I thought, okay, Doubting Thomas. Right? Maybe he was Tom to his friends. But that was it. That was it. Jesus and Tom is what she knew about the Bible. So I thought, all right, well, obviously it's not just my Boston University students who don't know anything about religion. So the next week, Sunday school was the story when Moses is in the desert and the Israelites are thirsty and he's mad and he hits the rock and the water comes flowing out of the rock. That was the conversation. And so we got in the car. I asked Lucy, my daughter, what'd you learn in Sunday school? And she was totally ready. She had been stumped the week before. Fool me once, but she's not going to be fooled twice. So she came back with the most amazing information about Moses. He's a little baby who's in the bulrushes. He was in Egypt. He told the Pharaoh, let my people go. The Pharaoh was like, no way. He was like, let my people go. The Pharaoh's like, no way. All the plagues. I told you so. You're going to get even more plagues. Then finally the Pharaoh says, okay, you can leave. And then he takes his people over to the Red Sea, and the Red Sea parts, and it doesn't part till the water gets practically up to his nose. He can barely even breathe, but he's so sure of God, the power of God will come. And and then he's in the desert wandering around for all these years, and he doesn't make it to the Promised Land. She told me everything basically about Moses except for the fact that God buried Moses, which is one of the things I love about Moses in the Hebrew Bible, that all the patriarchs are buried by their kin, but Moses is buried by God. And I turned to my other daughter, my older daughter, at this liberal Protestant Lutheran New England church, and I said, what did you learn today based on this story of Moses hitting the rock and the water flowing out? And she said, I learned about water as a scarce world resource. She said, I learned about evaporation, condensation, and precipitation. That's what she had learned. So I thought, all right. And then I was talking to this colleague of mine from Austria just a couple weeks later. He had come to Boston University to teach a course on Catholicism, the historical relationship between Roman Catholicism and Orthodoxy in the Christian tradition. And he was an expert on this. He was an expert on Orthodox. He was actually an advisor to the Pope. He was Catholic. He was an advisor to the Pope on Orthodox Christian Catholic relations. He was so excited to come to America and teach this course. He said to me, he said, Steve, I can't really teach this course because all my students, they go to church every Sunday and they don't know anything about Christianity. They had never even heard of Orthodoxy. They don't know the first thing. They don't know the history of the separation of Orthodoxy and Catholicism. He said, I feel like all I can do is teach them a basic intro to Christianity course. I can't teach this course. And he said, in Austria, things are totally different. No one would ever be caught dead going to church, and yet they've had religious education their entire lives, and they know tons about the Christian tradition. I'm perfectly happy to teach this course in Austria. And that really helped to clarify for me the central paradox of my last book, which is that the United States is one of the most religious countries on earth, and yet Americans know almost nothing about religion, very little about their own religions, and next to nothing about the religions of other people. So in that book, I had included in the back a dictionary of religious literacy where I took 100 or so key terms that I thought an educated citizen in America needed to know to make sense of American politics, where politicians refer to the Bible all the time, and world politics and economy, where religion matters. But I realized in looking at that book that the way people really think about religions is in terms of traditions. They think in terms of Hinduism and Judaism and Christianity and Buddhism, etc. And so I really wrote this book, God Is Not One, with the idea of providing basic religious literacy in terms of these great traditions. But as I was thinking about it, I was thinking, well, what's the argument that I want to present about the great religions as a whole? And the argument really came to me really as a result of my own education, both as an undergraduate and as a graduate student, where over and over I would hear that all the religions were basically the same. And every time I heard it, I didn't believe it. And in fact, my very first book that I wrote, which was a book that I'm sure all of you have bought and have read and have studied very carefully, it's called The White Buddhist. It sold 500 copies, maybe 505 copies. And almost all those were to libraries, and almost none of them were read by anyone in the libraries, which isn't just speculation. It's actually empirically verifiable because I have placed personally $5 bills in many of the copies of these books in libraries, and I have gone back to check, and either there are very wealthy readers of the books who don't care about the money, or else no one has opened the books. But in the beginning of this very important and utterly unread scholarly book that I wrote on the history of American Buddhism through the eyes of the first American convert to Buddhism, Henry Still Olcott, who is, alas, not yet a household name. In the preface to that book, I wrote about my experience as a graduate student, where I kept hearing at the Harvard Divinity School that all religions were basically the same, and how I just thought that was ridiculous, and I couldn't believe that educated people, much less professors, would tell me that, and that this book was, to some extent, a retort to that idea. And the editor of the book, the editor of the series, this was published in Indiana University Press, some obscure series on religion in North America, and the editor of the series said to me, you need to change. His main comment about my entire book was, you need to change the preface where you complain about Harvard Divinity School and all those people who think all religions are one, because if you publish that, you'll never get a job in this business again. And I did change it. I mean, I wanted a job. I had spent so many years in graduate school. I didn't totally take it out, but I pretty much changed it. But I didn't change my view. And so I decided that in this book I have tenure. I have a job at Boston University. I can say what I want to say. And so what I say in this book is that the idea that religions are different paths up the same mountain isn't true. And you can talk to anyone, almost, in any religion, who hasn't spent too much time in Harvard Square or in San Francisco, and they will tell you that the religions are the same, are different, that the religions are different. And this doesn't mean that we're fated to the clash of civilizations. I don't believe we're engaged in a clash of civilizations. I think that's an invention of television, and to some extent of books. But so that's the main argument of the book. But rather than telling you what the argument is, I will read a little bit. I want to read from, I think I'll read from 3 sections of the book, the beginning and end in the middle of the book. And I'm going to read a little bit from the introduction where I talk about questions, which was what attracts me to the religions. There's a lot of criticism of religions that they're about dogma and that they're about doctrine and that they make claims about how things really are in the face of the fact that we don't know how things really are. And I think actually religions are about asking and entertaining questions. At least that's for me what intrigues me about them. Less about the answers they give than the questions that they offer. And I think you can discriminate among the religions and see the differences across the religions based on the questions that they ask. So I want to read a section on that, and then I'll read something about Taoism, and then I'll read something about elephants. I think that's my strategy. So this is called Big Questions. Every year I tell my Boston University undergraduates that there are 2 worthy pursuits for college students. One is pre-professional, preparing for a career that will put food on the table and a roof overhead. The other is more personal, finding big questions worth asking, which is to say questions that cannot be answered in a semester or even in a lifetime. How do things come into being? How do they cease to be? How does change happen? How does anything stay the same? What is the self? Who or what is God? What happens when we die? As predictably as fall follows summer, incoming college students bring into classrooms big questions of this sort. And just as predictably, many professors try to steer them towards smaller things, questions that can be covered in an hour-long lecture and asked and answered on a final exam. But students have it right. At least in this case, bigger is better. Before I came to describe myself as religiously confused, I thought I had the answers to the big questions. I now know I didn't even have the questions right. If, as Muhammad once said, asking good questions is half of learning, I was at best a half-wit. Today I try to follow the advice of the German poet Rainer Maria Rilke to love the questions themselves, and not least this one from the American mystic Walt Whitman. And I quote, "What saw you to tell us what stays with you latest and deepest of curious panics, of hard-fought engagements or sieges tremendous, what deepest remains?" There are all sorts of reasons to try to become more religiously literate. One is civic. It is impossible to make sense of town or nation or world without reckoning with religion's extraordinary influence for good or for ill. There are also personal reasons to cultivate religious literacy, including the fact that learning about the world's religions empowers you to enter into a fascinating, multi-millennial conversation about birth and death, faith and doubt, meaning and confusion. American philosopher Richard Rorty has called religion a conversation stopper, and who hasn't had the experience of a knock on the door and a conversation run aground on the rocks of dogma? But religion also serves as a conversation starter. We human beings ask questions. We want to know why. Our happiness depends on it, and of course our misery. To explore the great religions is to stand alongside Jesus and the Buddha, Muhammad and Moses. It is to look out on a whole universe of questions with curiosity and awe. It is to meander, as all good conversations do, from topic to topic, question to question. Why are we here? Where are we going? How are we to live? Does God exist? Does evil do we? When people ask me how I became a religious studies professor, I usually say that I discovered the study of religion just as I was losing the Christian faith of my youth, and that this discipline gave me a way to hang in with religious questions, which continue to fascinate me, without the presumption that any answers were close at hand. When, to paraphrase St. Augustine, I became a question to myself, even bigger questions called out to me, and my ongoing conversation with the great religions began. One of the common misconceptions about the world's religions is that they plumb the same depths and ask the same questions. They do not. Only religions that see God as all good ask how a good God can allow millions to die in tsunamis, Only religions that believe in souls ask whether your soul exists before you are born and what happens to it after you die. And only religions that think we have one soul ask after the soul in the singular. Every religion, however, asks after the human condition. Here we are in these human bodies. What now? What next? What are we to become? This book explores the different answers to each of the great religions and has offered to discuss the different questions that they have asked. It aims to demonstrate how practitioners have lived the biggest of the big questions and to suggest ways that each of us today might also live these questions, not least the deceptively simple yet complex question of how to become a human being. That's from the introduction. The section I want to read from Taoism, and I talk in the book about these religions from the greatest to the least great. A working title for me when I was starting this book was The Great Religions, and I thought I should, instead of giving them in order of chronology or grouping them by geography, the Middle Eastern religions, the Chinese religions, the Indian religions, that I would do them in order of greatness. And I thought, why can't I do that? Why can't I decide what's the greatest religion, you know? So I'm writing the book. So I did, and I decided Islam was the greatest religion, which annoyed some people. But if you want to ask me about that later, I will tell you why. But the least of the great religions is Taoism, in my opinion, and the eight. But that doesn't mean it's the least interesting. I think it's actually one of the most interesting. So I'm going to read from a little section on Taoism. But one thing I tried to do in the book is we're trained in religious studies to get rid of our own biases, our own views about these traditions. It's a very odd profession, because if you're in political science, your job is to tell people what you think about political regimes. If you're an economist, your job is to tell people what's the best way to order the economy. If you're trained in religious studies, your job is to hide every single view you actually have about any religion, because otherwise you might seem to be, biased or like pushing for one religion or another. So I decided in this book I wasn't going to do that, and I was going to try to wrestle with these traditions in the same way that I imagine my readers might be. In other words, to just fess up when there's things in them that annoy me, and then to say when there's things in them that thrill me. So I think this section is more about the things in Taoism that thrill me, I think. And it's the last page or so, the last 2 pages of the Taoism chapter. It's called Change and Disappearance. In my home on Cape Cod, there's a small piece of paper taped to the refrigerator with the word change. I usually read this sign in the imperative voice as a command to make life new. But that isn't very wu-wei of me. Wu-wei means non-interference or natural action. That isn't very wu-wei of me to take aim at this change and to expend all sorts of energy to make it happen. A more Taoist interpretation would read change as an observation. If we live as if things are unchanging, our jobs, our families, our loves, our bodies, but in fact, all these things are changing every day. One of the most famous stories in the Zhuangzi, the Taoist scripture, is also one of the most vexing. It is set just after the death of Zhuangzi's wife. When a friend comes by to console him, he finds Zhuangzi beating a tub and singing with joy. Jewish law explicitly prohibits the making of music for 30 days after the death of a spouse, but Zhuangzi's singing and playing is also an affront to Confucian propriety and to our own. We don't mourn much in the modern West. The things we cannot control are shrinking every day, but death remains one of them, so we don't want to linger over it. Still, for most of us, the few hours that Zhuangzi gave over to grief seem a trifle. When his friend criticized him, Zhuangzi replied coolly that change is unavoidable and death is nothing to fear. As the 4 seasons progress from spring to summer to fall to winter, transformation comes to all things, he said. Why should any of us be exempt from this natural process? So do not be repelled from death or attracted to life, but treat both with equanimity and indifference. Oh, and do not be afraid to respond to sickness and death and to fear itself with laughter and music and play. For some practitioners, Taoism is about grasping after the brass ring of physical immortality. But at the heart of this tradition is nothing more magical than a life well lived. If we are confused about why such a goal is religious, that is because we are confused about religion, which, as China's traditions teach us, does not cease to be religious when it refuses to promise a changeless afterlife. After Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, the two great writers of the early Taoist scriptures, Taoism doubtless drinks deep of the gods and goddesses, scriptures and sects, priests and prayers we recognize as the stuff of organized religion. In fact, it dives into the deep end. But throughout its long evolution, it remains committed first and foremost to vitality, to the goal of human flourishing. For Confucius, to be human is to be social. For Taoists, to be human is to be natural. According to many Confucians, being human is not a birthright, but a hard-won accomplishment, and it is accomplished by the labors of society. The Confucian thinker Junzi, Mencius's nemesis, regularly resorted to metaphors from the trades, hammering, steaming, bending, to describe this arduous process of becoming something other than what we once were. Taoists, by contrast, claim that we are born human and are hammered out of our humanity through education. To return to our true nature, we need only to return to the natural rhythms of the Tao, accepting without resistance the flux and flow of everyday life. Summer to fall to winter to spring, morning to evening, morning to birth. Every year on Cape Cod, every Labor Day, visitors pull their boats out of the water, pack up their things, and drive away. I have seen this happen almost every year since I was in kindergarten, but it still has the power to upend me. I go to the ocean. I stay until almost everyone has left, chatting with the locals, pretending it is just another sunset. Before I make for home, I hear a childlike voice inside me wishing I could jump through some magical hoop to the middle of June, skipping over the nostalgia of fall and the slush of winter to another Cape Cod summer. But there is another voice, younger and older at the same time, that also speaks, reminding me that things change, that, as Lao Tzu says, the Tao that can be spoken is not the constant Tao, that summer here would not be summer if it did not follow on the bone-chilling bluster of spring. One of the grand motifs of Taoist stories is disappearance. An immortal known as the Lady of Great Mystery can point at temples and even entire cities and make them disappear. Isn't that great, by the way? I love that. She could make LA disappear. At the end of the biography celebrating her life, a Taoist analog to the hagiographies of Catholic saints, she is said to have ascended Christ-like to the heavens in broad daylight, never to be seen again. Lao Tzu goes by land rather than air, but he too wanders off. After depositing his wisdom with a border guard who asks him to offer his wisdom, which he does in the form of the Tao Te Ching, he enters into the undiscovered country, and his biographer tells us, no one knows what became of him. I love that too, by the way. Taoism can be distilled into stories of the human problem and its solution, stories of how lifelessness, the human problem, threatens, but flourishing, the human goal, triumphs. Its heart can be heard beating in exemplars known as sages and immortals who have mastered techniques to nourish life and roam in company with the Tao. But more than any of the great religions, Taoism possesses the power to vanish before our eyes, to get up and wander west, drift high into the mountains, and disappear into the clouds. Okay, and the last section I'll read before there won't be any criticisms, right? It'll just be friendly comments. What's that? Tiny criticism? All right, I won't call on her. I'm going to read this section. A lot of the people who have talked with me about the book so far, I've done some radio conversations, have talked to me about this. I don't really know why, but I guess I'm going to read from it because they do. This is about the story of the elephant, the blind man and the elephant story. I think I have a novel and very important new interpretation of this story. I'm going to share it with you. This is from the conclusion. I think it's the end of the book, actually. There's a famous folk tale about blind men examining an elephant. It likely originated in India before the Common Era, but it eventually spread to East and Southeast Asia and then around the world. According to this folk tale, one man feels the trunk and declares it to be a snake. Another feels the tail and declares it to be a rope. Others determine that the elephant is a wall, pillar, spear, or fan, depending on where they are touching it. But each insists he is right. So much quarreling ensues. Among true believers of the perennial philosophy sort, in other words, the types who say all religions are one, religions are different paths up the same mountain, this story is gospel. In their eyes, the elephant is God, and the blind men are Christians and Muslims and Jews who mistake their particular and partial perspectives on divinity for the reality of divinity itself. Because God is beyond human imagining, we are forever groping around for God in the dark. It is foolish to say that your religion alone is true and all others are false. No one has the whole truth, but each is touching the elephant. So concludes the Hindu teacher and inspiration for many perennialists, Ramakrishna. One can realize God through all religions. But this folktale also demonstrates how different religions are, since it has been told in various ways and put to various uses by various religious groups. Among Buddhists, it shows that speculation on abstract philosophical questions causes suffering. Among Sufis, Muslim mystics, it shows that God can be seen through the heart, but not through the senses. Hindus read it as a parable about how God can be reached by different paths. Finally, modern Western writers, such as the British poet John Godfrey Saxe, turn it into a tale of the stupidity of theology and the foolishness of religion. So oft in theologic wars, writes Saxe, the disputants I ween rail on in utter ignorance of what each other mean, and prate about an elephant not one of them has seen. For me, this story is a reminder not of the unity of the world's religions, as Ramakrishna and the perennialists would have us believe, or of their shared stupidity, as Saxe and the new atheists would argue, but of the limits of human knowledge. It is commonplace to think of religions as unchanging dogmas demanding unqualified assent, and there are no doubt fundamentalists inside most religions who see things just this way. But one function of the transcendent is to humble us, remind us that our thoughts are not the thoughts of God or the great goddess, to remind us that, at least for the time being, we see through a glass darkly. When it comes to safeguarding the world from the evils of religion, including violence by proxy from the hand of God, the claim that all religions are one is no more effective than the claim that all religions are poison. Far more powerful is the reminder that any genuine belief in what we call God should humble us, remind us that if there really is a god or goddess worthy of the name, he or she or it must surely know much more than we do about the things that matter most. This much, at least, is shared across the great religions. So that's what I have, and we have time for questions or comments or criticisms. And Islam is the greatest religion because it's second behind Christianity in terms of numbers. 33% of the world's population self-identifies as Christian, and 22% self-identifies as Muslim. So it's behind in that regard, though second. But it's gaining very, very quickly. In fact, if you look at this may be a vulgar way to think about it, but if you think about religions as having market share, like Coke and Pepsi and 7-Up, do they even sell 7-Up anymore? Sprite? Christianity's market share has declined over the last century from 35 to 33%. In other words, it's dying. And the market share of Islam has gone from 12% to 22%. In other words, it's almost doubled over the last century. Muslims are having children much faster, they're making converts much faster, they're keeping the converts much faster. They're also controlling the conversation. So much of influence is about who controls the conversation, and since 9/11, the conversation about religion is about Islam. When people say to me, I'm on an airplane and I say I'm a religious studies scholar, and sometimes they just turn away and fall asleep. But if they don't, they ask me about Islam. They don't ask me about Christianity. They don't ask me about Confucianism. They don't ask me about Taoism. They ask me about Islam. Also, Islam is the kind of religion that doesn't have the sorts of distinctions traditionally between, say, church and state that Christianity does. You know, this idea that, give to God what is God's, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, isn't traditional in the Islamic context. And so Islam has more of a hold over its participants than Christianity does. Also, the figure for Christianity of 33% counts a lot of Europe. It counts, in other words, baptized Christians in France. But how many baptized Christians in France actually even believe in God? I mean, most of them don't. So the Christian numbers are inflated by counting a lot of Europe as Christian. So those are the reasons. The other is also Muhammad. Muhammad is the most influential human being ever. He combines he does what Jesus, Paul, and Constantine do in Christianity. Christians need 3 guys to do what Muhammad did. So because he not only is the vehicle for the revelation, he's also the early lawgiver, the social leader, the political leader, and the military leader. He's the one who spreads the religion like Constantine does. He's the one who institutionalizes it like Paul does, and he's the one who bears the scripture and the prophecy the way that Jesus does. I think that's a pretty darn good argument for why Islam's the greatest. Yes, sir. Yeah. There are parallels. In fact, I was talking to a friend of mine who works in Singapore is a scholar of Islam, and he was talking about how in the 1830s in Indonesia, there was a lot of interest in Joseph Smith because Islam claims that Muhammad is the final prophet. And here was a religion that seemed to have a lot of parallels with Islam, with a prophet who brought a new scripture, the Book of Mormon, which was published in 1830. And the question was, like, is this the new Islam? Like, were we sort of wrong? Is this Islam 2.0? And there was a lot of writing, I'd never known about this, in the 1830s and the 1840s in Indonesia about this guy, Joseph Smith, on precisely these grounds, including the polygamy question. Like, he seemed to understand that, it wasn't right for a guy to have just one wife. Like, that number was too small, So other people have drawn that connection. And Mormonism is growing quickly. But, even so, Mormonism is growing fast. But you compare it as a world religion. I think the figure for Mormonism, and don't quote me on this, although this is being taped, isn't it? It's either 12 or 16 million. Pretty small, pretty small. But it is growing quickly, Mormonism is, all around the world, including in Latin America, which is surprising because in Mormonism you're not allowed to drink coffee. And so when the missionaries go down to Brazil, they say, hey, why don't you convert, but you need to stop drinking coffee. A lot of people who might be otherwise interested decide that that's not going to work for them. Yes, sir? I think that's right. I think that religions, as they move and change and spread, and as time moves on, need to adjust the kinds of questions that they ask. But I still think that they tend to hang in with the fundamental kind of question. So in Christianity, the problem is sin, and the question is, how do I get rid of sin? And I don't think that question has really fundamentally changed in Christianity. I still think that's a question, and I think it's very different from, say, the Buddhist question of the problem is suffering, and how do we get rid of suffering? In fact, if you are in the Christian camp and see the problem as sin and the goal is salvation, suffering might actually be good. And there's a whole tradition, of course, in Christianity, like that Jesus suffered. Like, the more we suffer, the more we're like Jesus, and the more closer we are to salvation, the closer we are to the religious goal. And so one religion takes you to maybe maximize your suffering, like we see in martyrdom, for example. Another tradition tells you to minimize the suffering. So I think that although the traditions change over time, and although they do ask different questions and respond to different social circumstances, I think their core, their root kinds of questions tend to stay similar. And I think that's why, for example, I talk in the book about how I don't want to talk about salvation in religions other than Christianity, because I think salvation is a Christian term. And when you say something like, who's going to be saved, you're asking a Christian question, right? That's the question that's asked by the centurion who's looking at Jesus on the cross. He says, well, what do I have to do to be saved? When you say, oh, Hindus can be saved, Hindus and Buddhists will be saved, you're being a nice Christian, but you're still being a Christian. And you should realize that when those Hindus and Buddhists are saved and they show up in heaven and everybody's singing like, Kumbaya and, oh God, our help in ages past, they're going to be pissed off, right? They don't want to be in heaven. They want to have moksha, they want to have nirvana. They want to have, whatever it is they're having, right? I mean, are the Christians going to be really happy when they show up in the afterlife and they're in the Muslim paradise? And like everybody's speaking Arabic? No, they're going to think, damn, I made a mistake, I should have converted when that Mormon missionary, sorry, not Mormon. I'm confusing Islam and Mormonism. So I do think the questions are very different, but I agree with you that the questions do change over time. I think the essential questions tend to stay similar, though. For me, the greatness question was basically two issues. One was historical influence, and the other was contemporary impact. And this made it very hard for me to decide where to put Judaism in the book. Because if you ask the historical influence question, Judaism maybe should be first. Because it gives rise to Christianity and Islam and is therefore the progenitor of the religion of over half human beings on the earth. But if you ask contemporary impact and you say, here's a religion with 16 million people, Judaism, it's teeny. It shouldn't even be in the book. I actually considered having it not in the book. I thought that might actually get a lot of press and sell a lot of books. The great religions, no Judaism. It's not great enough for my book. But so I weighed the two. But I focused on contemporary impact. But I did not focus on which of the religions has the best beliefs. That said, when I wrote the book, I did allow myself to respond as a human being to the things that I found troubling and that I found wonderful in each religion. And for example, when I read the Quran in working on this project, I was able to say, I just found the repetition in the Quran of fire and brimstone really annoying. I hated it. And I didn't want to keep hearing it. And I tried to wrestle with why it's so repetitive, because a good piece of it is about reminding you. Just remember that God is in charge, that you are not in charge, so that you won't go to this fiery afterlife, option. But I still gave voice to that I found it annoying. And I gave voice to the things I found annoying in other religions too, and the things that I found inspiring. By the way, I will say that one other reason to not confuse the world's religions is that if you think they're all the same, you can't appreciate the unique beauty of any of them. What's uniquely beautiful about Taoism if it's just the same as Christianity? It's like, you've seen one, you've seen them all, right? You were raised a Christian, you don't need to learn anything about Confucianism or Taoism or Buddhism because they're all basically the same. I think they're very, very different, and I think they speak to different problems in the human condition, and they respond. If you want to figure out how to get rid of your suffering, and you believe that is in part brought on by mental, machinations, it makes sense to listen to a tradition that for 2,500 years has been trying to figure out how to, meditate and chant in order to respond to the deep patterns that humans get into to make themselves suffer, and that's Buddhism. But if you don't really care about that, and you're racked with original sin and you want salvation, then you should listen to Jesus. He's the person you should be talking with. Okay, so of all the religions, of all of them, Hinduism, well, I'm not saying you should read any, I'm not for any of the religions saying, oh, right, this book, right, thank you, Ani, you should read this book. I'm not saying that I'm not focusing on the scriptures of the religions. In fact, I make the explicit argument that to reduce religions to their scriptures is the sort of thing Protestants do. That's what the Protestant Reformation was to a great extent about. The Catholics have Christianity wrong. Christianity is about the Bible. You should read the Bible in your own language. So I don't believe that religions are about their scriptures, and I certainly wouldn't reduce them to that. That said, the part of what you said I agree with, aside from the moronic, monolithic, and myopic piece, is that Hinduism is vast. I mean, Hinduism of all the traditions is the most freewheeling. It's the most difficult to pin down to any one thing. Why? Because it's ancient, for one. Two, which you mentioned, it has a lot of different scriptures. Three, and most importantly, it has an absorptive strategy. The strategy of the monolithic, the strategy of the monotheistic religions, another M word, of the West, is to say no. Like when a new religion comes in, you say no. You say that's the false God. We have the God, right? The strategy of the Hindus, which is equally annoying if you ask me, is to say yes. You just bring them in, right? So the new religion comes in, the Christians show up, and you're like, oh, I'm so glad you finally came because Jesus is one of the avatars of Vishnu, you know? I mean, you know, you're 1,000 years after or 2,000 years after the Buddha, who is also one of the avatars of Vishnu, but it's nice to have you here. And you just sort of fold them all in. So when you're always folding the religions in, all those religions' influences into your tradition, it becomes very hard to say, here I stand, right? Like Martin Luther says in the Protestant Reformation, here I stand, I can do no different, right? So I agree with you on that. That said, I still want to say that it is not impossible to talk about the kinds of problems that Hindus attack that are different. You know, classically in Hinduism, the problem is that we just keep being born over and over again. And now Hindus have a lot of different ways to respond to that problem, right? Through these various yogas or margas that they have, right? It might be devotion, or it might be wisdom, or it might be karma, action. But still, I think it's fair to say, and I do argue, that the core problem in Hinduism is the fact that we keep being reborn over and over again, and that's not a good thing. And we want to get out of that. And the scriptures, whether it's the Mahabharata or the Ramayana or whatever it is, are responding broadly to that question. Now, are they asking other questions about ethics, about war, about gender relations, about the economy? Absolutely. And all religions do that. At least the religions that survive and prosper, they have to. They have to respond to a lot of different aspects of human life. But I still think that you can generalize about Hinduism, even though generalizations about Hinduism are probably more dangerous than about any of the religions that I've discussed in the book. Well, I've always taught about religion, so I think my students respond always with great questions. You know, I mean, I think that the students, I mean, the course it was mentioned earlier, I teach a course called Death and Immortality, which is our sort of stealth course in the Department of Religion because it doesn't have the word religion in it. And a lot of young people think religion is a bad word. So they don't want to be in a course with the word religion. So we lure them in with a course called Death and Immortality. They think, I like immortality and I don't want to die, so maybe I should come to the course. But they respond, you know, like I said in the first piece that I read, they respond with wonderful questions, and I think that I try to entertain them and keep them alive in the classroom and give the sorts of responses that different religions have to them. I'll try to reframe the question. The question had to do with what about spirituality? Here's 8 religions, right? What about spirituality, and particularly, what about the kind of spirituality that wants to have a different understanding of the creation story that's more friendly to the environment? More realistic and more friendly to the environment. And I think it's a great question. And this book is not about spirituality per se, although I always disagree with people who want to draw a sharp line between religion and spirituality, because where do these spiritual traditions come from? They come from religions. They're carried down through centuries and millennia by religions that, yes, may have annoying institutions and annoying leaders who tell you what to do and boss you around, but they have kept these traditions alive, right? So great to love yoga, but don't totally diss Hinduism, because Hindus are the people who kept this thing happening that made you able to do it, and maybe we could figure it out. So that said, though, you know, my students are really interested in spirituality, and they're not interested in religion. And I think that there is a kind of pan-spirituality that's being developed by people like Ken Wilber and others that you mentioned that is trying to draw on multiple religious traditions. And I frankly don't have a problem with that. The problem I have is when people try to not admit what they're doing, right? To say, oh, well, all the religions are the same and I'm just reporting. I'm much happier when they say, I know the religions are different, but like, check it out. This is my game. I'm going to pretend they're all the same. And I'm going to pretend that, they're all saying like we should protect the earth. And here are the resources inside each of them for doing that. And I think that's fine. And I think that that's important. But I think that that's a theological and an imaginative project that's different from the sort of repertorial scholarly project of trying to say what the religions have stood for. In terms of the environment, I think it's really interesting to look at the religions and see what resources they have for taking care of the environment. And there are some wonderful resources, and there are some dangers. We talked a little about Hinduism. One of the things in Hinduism that you have is the notion that that water and rivers are goddesses, and that they can sort of purify anything you put into them because they're so powerful and so wonderful. And this is actually, some people have argued, this is one reason why we've allowed our rivers and our oceans to be despoiled, is because the idea is that they're sort of so sacred that they can take any pollution that we can put into them. So here's a good idea that also has some dangerous, can have some dangerous consequences. And certainly in the Christian tradition, you have resources where, humans seem to be told to go out and boss around the other animals by naming them, among other things. But then you also have the notion that humans are supposed to go out and be good stewards over the universe, right? In the traditions of India, you have a slippage between humans and other animals, right? The Jewish, Christian, and Muslim context for humans is they're very different from other animals, right? They're created, they have their own day, they're created in a different way from other animals, and so they're somehow utterly distinct in a way. But in traditions in which humans can be reborn as animals and animals can be reborn as humans, you might care more about animals if one of them is your great-grandmother, right? So there are resources there for environmental questions that we don't have necessarily in the monotheisms of the West. So okay, I will stay around, but I think we should draw to a close our public presentation, and I'm happy to sign books and entertain questions. And thank you very much for having me, and thank you all for coming. I really enjoyed our time.